Kethavar stared at the tactical display with growing confusion. The blue dots representing human ships moved in patterns that made no sense. They should be running. They should be screaming. They should be begging for mercy like every other species the hegemony had encountered. Instead, they were sending messages. "Sir?" His communications officer buzzed through the translator device. "The humans are requesting a formal meeting." Kethavar's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. In his 300 years of military service, no species had ever requested a meeting after seeing the hegemony fleet. The massive ships that stretched for kilometers, armed with weapons that could crack planets, usually sent primitive civilizations into immediate panic. A meeting? Kethavar clicked his mandibles together, a sign of deep thought among his people. Are they surrendering? No, sir, they want to discuss terms of engagement. The words hit Kethavar like a physical blow. Terms of engagement? What did that even mean? War was simple. The strong destroyed the weak. The survivors became slaves. There were no terms to discuss. On the main screen, a human face appeared. The creature had only 2 eyes positioned awkwardly on the front of its head. Its skin was pale and smooth, lacking the protective carapace that any sensible species would have evolved. This particular human wore a uniform covered in colorful patches and metal symbols. "I am Captain Lee Hyun of the Earth Defense Force," the human said in surprisingly clear Galactic Common. "I wish to speak with your commanding officer about the rules of engagement for this conflict." Kethavar felt his brain struggling to process the words. Rules for conflict? It was like asking for rules about breathing or eating. You simply did what you had to do to win. "I am Senior Tactical Analyst Kethavar," he replied, his translator converting his clicking sounds into Galactic Common. "There are no rules in war. You will surrender or you will be destroyed." The human called Lee Hyun tilted his head slightly. "With respect, sir, we cannot accept those terms. Even in war, there must be laws. We propose establishing proper protocols before any hostilities begin." Kethavar's confusion deepened. The human spoke as if war was some kind of game with rules that both sides agreed to follow. This made no sense. Why would anyone limit their ability to win? "Explain these." "Protocols," Kethavar said finally. Captain Lee Hyun nodded. "First, we must formally declare the state of war. Both sides should acknowledge that hostilities are beginning. Second, we need agreements about the treatment of prisoners, the protection of non-combatants, and the limits of acceptable weapons." Each word felt like a small explosion in Kethavar's mind. Protection of non-combatants? Why would you protect the enemy's breeding population? That was exactly what you wanted to eliminate to prevent future resistance. And limits on weapons? The whole point of having superior weapons was to use them. "You want us to protect your civilians?" Kethavar asked slowly. "We want both sides to protect all civilians," Lee Hyun corrected. "Your non-military personnel would receive the same protection as ours." This statement nearly caused Kethavar to fall from his command pod. Protect the enemy's civilians? These humans were either the most clever negotiators he had ever encountered, or they were completely insane. "Why would you suggest such a thing?" Kethavar demanded. "Because civilization requires certain standards," Lee Hyun replied calmly. "We have learned that how we fight says as much about us as why we fight. We will not abandon our principles even in the face of destruction." Kethavar looked around his bridge. His crew members were all staring at the screen with expressions of complete bewilderment. Some were making the rapid clicking sounds that indicated extreme stress. Others had retreated into their shells, a defensive posture his species took when confronted with something incomprehensible. "You would rather die than fight effectively?" Kethavar asked. "We would rather die as civilized beings than live as monsters," Lee Hyun said simply. The human's words echoed in the sudden silence of the bridge. Kethavar had spent his entire life in military service. He had conquered 17 species for the hegemony. Some had fought bravely, others had begged pathetically, but none had ever suggested that there should be rules about how to destroy them. "I need to consult with my superiors," Kethavar said finally. "Of course." Lee Hyun nodded. "We will transmit our proposed rules of engagement to your ship. Please review them carefully. We believe that even enemies can maintain honor." The transmission ended, leaving Kethavar alone with his swirling thoughts. Honor between enemies? The concept was so alien that he struggled to even think about it properly. His second-in-command, a younger officer named Vithrak, approached the command pod. "Sir, should we simply ignore their requests and begin the attack?" Kethavar considered this. It would be the normal procedure. But something about the humans' calm confidence troubled him. They had seen his fleet. They knew they were outgunned by a massive margin. Yet they showed no fear, made no desperate attempts to flee. Instead, they wanted to have a civilized discussion about how to fight their own destruction. Send their proposals to Fleet Command, Kethavar ordered. Let the admirals decide how to respond to this unusual situation. As his crew worked to transmit the human documents, Kethavar found himself studying the tactical display again. The human ships remained in formation, neither advancing nor retreating. They seemed to be simply waiting, as if they had all the time in the world. Hours passed. Finally, a response came from Admiral Park Jiwoo, the Supreme Commander of the human forces. The message was brief and formal. The Earth Defense Force will await your decision regarding our proposed rules of engagement. We hope for an honorable conflict. Hope for an honorable conflict. Kethavar repeated the phrase in his mind, trying to understand it. How could anyone hope for war to be honorable? War was about survival, about dominance, about the strong consuming the weak. Honor had nothing to do with it. Yet these humans seemed genuinely convinced that it did. Kethavar settled back in his command pod and began reading the human proposals. Each page brought new confusion. Rules about treating wounded enemies with medical care. Rules about allowing surrendered enemies to live. Rules about minimizing damage to civilian areas. It was as if the humans had taken everything that made war effective and decided to voluntarily give it up. As he read, one thought kept returning to his mind. Either these humans were the weakest species he had ever encountered, or they understood something about war that his entire civilization had missed. The question was, which one was true? 3 days later, Kethavar found himself in the strangest meeting of his life. The humans had actually convinced the Hegemony Command to send negotiators, not because they feared human military power, but because the admirals were as confused as Kethavar about these bizarre creatures. The meeting took place on a neutral space station that the humans had quickly constructed at the edge of their solar system. Kethavar accompanied the Hegemony delegation as a tactical advisor, though he suspected his real purpose was to help translate the incomprehensible human thinking for his superiors. Commander Kim Dae-hyun sat across from them at a simple metal table. Next to him was Dr. Choi Mirai, introduced as a specialist in alien cultures. Both humans appeared completely relaxed, as if they were discussing trade agreements rather than the terms of their own potential destruction. Thank you for agreeing to this discussion, Kim Dae-hyun began. We understand this is unusual, but we believe it benefits everyone involved. Hegemony Admiral Orth Kess, the expedition's military commander, leaned forward aggressively. Explain to me why we should limit our ability to defeat you quickly. Dr. Choi Mirai spoke up. Because quick victory through unlimited destruction creates more problems than it solves. We have studied galactic history. Species conquered through total war often remain rebellious for generations. Those defeated honorably often become valuable allies. Kethavar translated this, though he had to pause several times to find words in his language for concepts like honorable defeat and valuable allies. His people had words for complete submission and useful slaves, but the human concepts seemed different somehow. You want to become our allies after we defeat you? Admiral Orth Kess asked with obvious confusion. We want the possibility to remain open, Kim Dae-hyun replied. But more importantly, we want both sides to maintain their dignity and moral standing regardless of who wins. Moral standing. Another phrase that Kethavar struggled to translate. His people measured standing through military success and resource acquisition. The idea that how you fought might matter as much as whether you won was completely foreign. Kim Dae-hyun placed a tablet on the table. These are our proposed Geneva Conventions for space warfare. They are based on laws my people developed for fighting each other, adapted for conflicts between different species. Kethavar looked at the document. It was massive, hundreds of pages of detailed rules covering every aspect of warfare he could imagine, and many he could not. You have laws for fighting your own species? He asked, forgetting protocol in his surprise. Of course, Dr. Choi Mirai said. We learned long ago that unlimited warfare destroys everything we might hope to gain from victory. These laws help ensure that wars end with viable societies, not just smoking ruins. Admiral Orth Kess scoffed. Smoking ruins are easier to control. Perhaps, Kim Dae-hyun agreed. But they are much less useful. A population that has been treated with respect during defeat is more likely to contribute productively to the victor's society. As they went through the documents, Kethavar found his confusion growing deeper rather than clearer. The humans wanted rules about everything. Medical personnel could not be targeted. Prisoners must be fed and housed properly. Wounded enemies must be given medical care. Civilian areas should be avoided when possible. What if civilian areas contain military targets? Admiral Orthkes asked. Then we use precision weapons to minimize civilian casualties, Kim Dae-hyun replied. We accept that this might make our military objectives harder to achieve. Kethavar stopped translating and stared at the human. You would make your own victory more difficult to protect enemy civilians. Yes. The simple, immediate response hit Kethavar like a physical blow. There was no hesitation, no calculation of advantage. The human had answered as if protecting enemy civilians was as natural as breathing. Why? Kethavar asked. Dr. Choi Mirai leaned forward. Because those civilians are not our enemies. They are simply beings who happen to be born in a place we are fighting with. They have done nothing to deserve destruction. Deserve destruction, another concept that did not translate well. In Kethavar's understanding, you were destroyed if you were weak enough to be destroyed. The universe did not care about what you deserved. But they support your enemies, Admiral Orthkes pointed out. They provide resources, breeding population, economic support. Some do, Kim Dae-hyun acknowledged. But many are simply trying to live their lives. Our goal is to change the government and military that oppose us, not to punish every individual in their society. The meeting continued for hours. The humans had rules for everything: how to treat prisoners during interrogation, how to mark medical facilities so they would not be accidentally targeted, how to handle surrender attempts, how to manage prisoner exchanges. What amazed Kethavar most was that the humans seemed to have thought through every possible situation. This was not a hastily prepared document designed to confuse their enemies. This was a comprehensive system that they genuinely intended to follow. You really plan to follow all of these rules? He asked during a break. Absolutely, Dr. Choi Mirai replied. We have military courts that prosecute our own soldiers if they violate these laws. Following the rules is not optional for us. Even if following the rules means you lose the war. The human woman was quiet for a moment. We believe that some victories cost more than they are worth. If we can only win by abandoning everything we believe in, then we have lost something more important than a war. That evening, Kethavar sat alone in his quarters, trying to process what he had learned. The humans had shown him detailed records of their own history, including wars where they had prosecuted their own generals for violating these laws of war. They had actually punished their own military leaders for being too effective at killing enemies. It made no sense from any practical standpoint he could understand. Yet the humans seemed completely serious about it. They would rather lose a war than win it dishonorably. The next day brought the most confusing development yet. A hegemony patrol ship had suffered a reactor failure during a routine reconnaissance mission. The crew was floating in space, their life support failing. Without being asked, the humans immediately dispatched rescue ships. Kethavar watched from his ship as human medical vessels pulled hegemony warriors from their damaged craft. The same enemies they were preparing to fight were being saved by human rescue teams. Why are they doing this? Vithrak asked, staring at the display. Kethavar had no answer. By every logical measure, the humans should let their enemies die. Fewer enemies meant easier victory. But instead, they were using their own resources to save hegemony lives. When Admiral Orthkes contacted the human fleet to demand an explanation, Captain Lee Hyun's response was simple. They needed help. That night, Kethavar began reading human history files with desperate intensity. He needed to understand how a species could survive while thinking this way. Everything he knew about evolution and survival suggested that such attitudes should have been eliminated long ago. What he found disturbed him even more. The humans had not always been this way. Their history was filled with wars as brutal as any the hegemony had fought. But somehow, over time, they had developed these strange ideas about honor and mercy. And despite following these limiting rules, they had not grown weak. Their civilization had grown stronger. Kethavar fell asleep that night with his mind spinning. Nothing about these humans made sense, yet they were clearly intelligent and successful. He was beginning to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with his understanding of how the universe worked. The negotiations had failed as Kethvar had expected they would. Admiral Orthkes could not accept rules that limited hegemony military effectiveness, and the humans refused to fight without their laws of war. So the fighting began, and with it came Kethvar's complete mental breakdown. It started when his ship was hit by human weapons during the first major battle. The humans had honored their promise to avoid civilian vessels, targeting only military craft with precise strikes. But Kethvar's ship had been classified as a military intelligence vessel, making it a legitimate target. As his ship broke apart around him, Kethvar prepared for death. In hegemony culture, defeated warriors who could not escape were expected to self-terminate rather than burden their captors. He reached for his ceremonial poison capsule, but before he could use it, a human rescue pod latched onto his escape pod. Lieutenant Yoon Taek appeared in the airlock, wearing a bulky environmental suit adapted for alien physiology. "Are you injured?" he asked in careful galactic common. Kethvar stared at him in confusion. "You are rescuing me?" "Of course. You are wounded and in distress. That makes you our responsibility." The human pulled Kethvar from his damaged pod with surprising gentleness. During the short trip to the human medical ship, Yoon Taek checked Kethvar's injuries and administered basic first aid, talking constantly in a calm, reassuring voice. "The medics will take good care of you," the human said. "Oh, Sungmin is one of our best. He has been studying alien physiology so he can treat wounded prisoners properly." Wounded prisoners. The phrase hit Kethvar like a physical blow. In hegemony thinking, there were no wounded prisoners. You either died in battle or you died shortly after being captured. The idea of providing medical care to captured enemies was completely insane. The human medical bay was unlike anything Kethvar had ever seen. Clean, bright, and filled with equipment he did not recognize. But what shocked him most were the other patients. Dozens of aliens from various species, all receiving medical care from human doctors and nurses. Oh Sungmin approached with a medical scanner. "Welcome," he said cheerfully. "I know this must be frightening, but you are safe here. Let me see what we need to fix." Safe. Kethvar had to process that word several times. He was a prisoner of war on an enemy ship, surrounded by aliens who had every reason to hate him. Yet the human medic spoke as if his safety was the most important thing in the universe. The medical examination was thorough and professional. Oh Sungmin explained every procedure, asked permission before touching him, and showed genuine concern for his comfort. When Kethvar winced at a particularly painful scan, the medic immediately adjusted the settings and apologized. "I know our medical techniques are different from yours," Oh Sungmin said, "but the basic principles of healing are universal. We will not let you suffer if we can prevent it." Over the following days, Kethvar was transferred to a human prisoner facility on a captured asteroid. He expected a dark dungeon filled with torture devices and interrogation equipment. Instead, he found something that broke his understanding of reality completely. The facility looked more like a small city than a prison. Clean dormitories, recreational areas, a library, even gardens where prisoners could grow food from their homeworlds. Captain Nam Yunbi, the facility commander, gave him a personal tour as if he were an honored guest rather than a captured enemy. "We house prisoners according to their species needs," she explained. "Different gravity requirements, atmospheric preferences, dietary restrictions. We want everyone to be as comfortable as possible during their stay. As if imprisonment was a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent condition. "Why do you do this?" Kethvar asked. Captain Nam Yunbi stopped walking and looked at him seriously. "Because you are still a person. Being our enemy in war does not change that. You have the right to be treated with dignity regardless of the circumstances. Rights, dignity, person." Each word was another small explosion in Kethvar's mind. In hegemony thinking, prisoners were resources to be used until they broke. The idea that they retained any rights or dignity was completely foreign. The tour continued. Kethvar saw prisoners attending educational classes, learning human languages and customs. He saw recreational activities, exercise facilities, even a workshop where prisoners could practice crafts from their home cultures. Most shocking of all, he saw a communications center where prisoners could send messages to their families. "You let prisoners contact their homeworlds?" he asked in amazement. "Once per week," Captain Nam Yunbi confirmed. Families deserve to know their loved ones are safe. We also allow prisoners to receive care packages from home, within security limitations. That evening, Kethvar sat in his comfortable quarters, trying to process what he had experienced. The humans had given him a private room, 3 meals a day, access to entertainment and educational materials, and the promise of weekly communication with his nest family. By hegemony standards, he was being treated better than many of their own soldiers. The next shock came during his first week, when he witnessed a human military trial. A human soldier had been accused of striking a prisoner during an interrogation. The trial was conducted with full ceremony, complete with advocates for both sides and careful examination of evidence. The soldier was found guilty and sentenced to reduction in rank and confinement. His commanding officer publicly apologized to the prisoner who had been struck, and new training protocols were implemented to prevent future incidents. Kethvar watched in stunned silence as the humans punished their own warrior for being too aggressive with an enemy. It violated every principle of military efficiency he understood. Yet the other prisoners in the facility watched with obvious respect and gratitude. Later that day, an older prisoner named Elder Krithos approached him during the evening meal. Krithos had been captured months earlier and had observed human behavior extensively. "You look confused. Young analyst," the elder said in their native tongue. "These humans make no sense," Kethvar replied. "They weaken themselves at every opportunity. They should have conquered the galaxy by now if they are this technologically advanced. Instead, they handicap themselves with impossible rules." Elder Krithos was quiet for a long moment. "I have been thinking about that," he said finally. "I believe we may have misunderstood what strength means." "What do you mean?" "Watch how the other prisoners behave around the humans. Fear, yes, some, but also respect, even gratitude. I have seen captured hegemony warriors volunteer to help with facility maintenance. Not because they are forced to, but because they want to contribute to this community the humans have created." Kethvar looked around the dining hall. Elder Krithos was right. The atmosphere was not what he would expect in a prison. Prisoners and guards interacted with mutual respect. There was no hatred, no desire for revenge, no desperate plotting for escape. "In our culture," Elder Krithos continued, "prisoners dream only of escape or revenge. Here, some prisoners have requested to stay even after prisoner exchanges were arranged. They prefer this life to returning to their home worlds." That night, Kethvar lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. Everything he had believed about strength, war, and civilization was crumbling around him. The humans had shown him a form of power he had never imagined, the power to transform enemies into something approaching friends. He began to wonder what other impossible things these humans might be capable of. And for the first time in his life, he found himself questioning whether the hegemony's way of doing things was actually the best way. The thought terrified him almost as much as it fascinated him. After 2 months in human custody, Kethvar made a discovery that shattered what remained of his worldview. He found out the humans could have ended the war in days, but chose not to. It happened during one of his regular sessions with Dr. Shin Hana, a human psychologist who had been studying alien thought patterns. The sessions were supposedly to help humans better understand prisoner needs, but Kethvar suspected they were really designed to help him understand humans. "You seem troubled today," Dr. Shin Hana observed during their weekly meeting. "I received a message from my nest family yesterday," Kethvar said. "They told me about the latest battle reports. Your people won another major engagement, but they allowed most of our fleet to retreat safely." "Why?" Dr. Shin Hana was quiet for a moment. "What do you think we should have done?" "Destroyed them completely. That is what the hegemony would do. That is what any logical military force would do. Instead, your Admiral Park Jiwoo ordered pursuit to stop once our ships began withdrawing. He let thousands of enemy warriors escape to fight another day." "And you think this was a mistake?" Kethvar leaned forward intensely. "I think it was insane unless—" He paused, a terrible thought occurring to him. "Unless you are not capable of destroying our fleet completely." Dr. Shin Hana smiled sadly. "Would you like to see our actual military capabilities?" She activated a holographic display that filled the room. What Kethvar saw made his breathing stop. Technical specifications for human weapons that could destroy entire star systems. Fleet deployments that outnumbered the hegemony forces by factors of 10. Manufacturing capabilities that could produce ships faster than the hegemony could destroy them. We have been using approximately 5% of our military capacity in this conflict, Dr. Shinhana said quietly. 5%. Kethavar stared at the numbers, his mind struggling to process them. The humans had been winning battles while barely trying. They could have overwhelmed the hegemony completely, conquered every world, enslaved every population. Why? He whispered. Because total victory through overwhelming force would violate our principles. We could destroy your civilization, but then we would be responsible for billions of deaths. Instead, we prefer to demonstrate our superiority gradually, hoping your leaders will see reason before more lives are lost. General Bayek Minho entered the room at that moment, as if summoned by their conversation. The human military commander was visiting the facility to review prisoner conditions, but he took time to speak with Kethavar personally. Dr. Shinhana has been telling me about your studies of our military philosophy, the general said. Do you have questions? Kethavar had thousands of questions, but one burned more urgently than the others. Your people have weapons that could end this war immediately. Planet-killing devices, system-destroying capabilities. Why do you not use them? General Bakmino sat down heavily. Because some victories cost too much. Yes, we could destroy every hegemony world in a matter of weeks, but then we would be responsible for the deaths of trillions of innocent beings. That is not a burden we are willing to accept. But they are your enemies. Their governments are our enemies, the general corrected. Most of their populations are simply beings trying to live their lives. They did not choose this war. Why should they pay the price for their leaders' decisions? Kethavar felt his mind reeling again. So you limit your own power to protect your enemy's civilians? We limit our destructive power to protect innocent life, regardless of which side they are on. True strength is not about how much damage you can cause. It is about how much restraint you can show while still achieving your objectives. That evening, Elder Krethos found Kethavar sitting alone in the facility's garden, staring at the alien plants the humans had somehow acquired to make prisoners feel more at home. You look like someone who has seen too much truth for one day, the elder observed. They could destroy us all, Kethavar said numbly. Completely. Utterly. They have weapons we cannot even imagine. Fleets larger than our entire civilization. Manufacturing capacity that makes us look like primitives playing with toys. Yes, Elder Krethos agreed. I learned this weeks ago. How can you be so calm about it? The elder settled beside him on the garden bench. Because I realized something important. Power that chooses not to destroy is far more frightening than power that destroys everything it touches. Kethavar looked at him in confusion. Think about it, Elder Krethos continued. We understand enemies who want to kill us. We can fight them, trick them, defend against them. But what do you do with enemies who refuse to hate you, who treat you with kindness while demonstrating they could annihilate you at any moment? Who win battles while following rules that protect your civilians better than your own military does? The questions hung in the air like physical weights. Kethavar had no answers for them. I have been studying human history, Elder Krethos said. Did you know they used to fight wars the way we do? Total destruction, unlimited violence, complete subjugation of enemies? What changed? They realized that kind of war destroys the things you are trying to protect. They developed these laws of war not to be kind to their enemies, but to preserve their own souls. They learned that unlimited violence corrupts the victor as much as it destroys the defeated. Over the following days, Kethavar threw himself into studying human military history with desperate intensity. He read about their ancient wars, where armies slaughtered entire populations and salted the earth so nothing could grow. He read about their gradual development of rules limiting warfare, protecting non-combatants, treating prisoners humanely. What shocked him most was learning that humans regularly held their own leaders accountable for war crimes. They had actually executed their own generals for ordering massacres. They had prosecuted their own soldiers for torturing prisoners. They had paid reparations to enemy populations they had wronged. The humans had deliberately limited their own power because they believed that how you won was as important as whether you won. Dr. Shin Hana found him in the library late one night, surrounded by books and data tablets. Finding answers? She asked. Finding more questions, Kethavar replied. Your people have voluntarily given up every military advantage that made sense to my understanding. You protect enemy civilians, treat prisoners well, limit your weapons, follow rules that make victory harder, yet you keep winning. Perhaps your understanding of what makes military sense needs updating. Kethvar looked up at her. Explain. When you conquer through fear and brutality, you create enemies who will fight you forever. When you conquer through demonstration of superior morality, you create allies who choose to join you. Which approach do you think creates more lasting stability? That night, Kethvar lay awake thinking about human military doctrine. They were not just fighting to win battles. They were fighting to win the peace that would follow. They were planning not just for victory, but for the kind of galaxy they wanted to live in after the war ended. It was a kind of strategic thinking so advanced that his own people had never even considered it. The humans were not just fighting their current enemies. They were fighting to ensure that future generations would remember them as liberators rather than conquerors. For the first time since his capture, Kethvar began to hope that the humans would win. Not because he had abandoned loyalty to his own people, but because he was beginning to understand that a human victory might be the best thing that could happen to the galaxy. The thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. The moment that changed everything came 6 months into Kethvar's imprisonment. Ambassador Kang Jiung arrived at the facility with an offer that defied all logic. They wanted his help. We are having difficulty communicating our principles to other alien species, she explained during their first meeting. They react the same way you did initially. They cannot understand why we limit our own military effectiveness. Kethvar studied the human diplomat carefully. You want me to translate for you? More than translate. We want you to help us teach other species about our laws of war. You understand both perspectives now. You know what it feels like to think our approach is insane, and you understand why we follow it anyway. The request was so unexpected that Kethvar had to ask her to repeat it. The humans wanted a former enemy to help them spread their military philosophy to other civilizations. It was either the most brilliant propaganda move he had ever heard of, or they genuinely believed in their principles so deeply that they trusted their former enemies to represent them. Why would you trust me with something so important? He asked. Because you have seen our principles in action, Ambassador Kang Jiung replied. You know we follow them even when it costs us military advantage. Other species need to hear that testimony from someone who was initially skeptical. Colonel Lim Sang-hyun, who had accompanied the ambassador, leaned forward. We are facing a crisis, Kethvar. Several alien civilizations are trying to exploit what they see as our weakness. They think our laws of war make us easy targets. They are wrong, Kethvar said immediately, surprising himself with his certainty. We know that. You know that. But they do not know that. We need to find a way to demonstrate that following laws of war actually makes us stronger, not weaker. Over the following weeks, Kethvar found himself working closely with human military and diplomatic experts. His role was to help them understand how alien minds interpreted human behavior, and to suggest ways of explaining human principles that other species could understand. The work was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. He was essentially helping design propaganda that would spread human values throughout the galaxy. Yet the more he worked with them, the more he became convinced that this was exactly what the galaxy needed. The first major test came when the Zephyrian Empire launched a surprise attack on human colonies. Believing that human laws of war would prevent effective retaliation, the Zephyrians were a proud warrior culture that saw mercy as weakness and restraint as cowardice. Kethvar watched the human response with intense interest. Would they abandon their principles when faced with an enemy that actively tried to exploit them? They did not. The human counterattack was swift, precise, and devastating. But it followed every law of war the humans had established. Zephyrian military targets were destroyed with surgical precision. Civilian areas were carefully avoided. When Zephyrian ships attempted to surrender, they were accepted immediately and their crews treated according to human prisoner protocols. Most importantly, when human forces had the opportunity to destroy the Zephyrian homeworld completely, they instead captured it intact and immediately began providing humanitarian aid to the civilian population. The battle lasted 3 weeks. The war lasted 1. How did you do that? Kethvar asked Colonel Lim Sang-hyun after reviewing the battle reports. The Zephyrians expected us to fight the way they fight, the colonel replied. They prepared for total war, mutual destruction, desperate last stands. Instead, we gave them disciplined military action combined with obvious moral superiority. Their own population turned against their government. Kethvar studied the reports more carefully. The colonel was right. Faced with human forces that destroyed military targets while delivering food and medical supplies to civilians, the Zephyrian population had begun to question why they were fighting these strange enemies, who seemed more concerned with Zephyrian welfare than their own government. Their soldiers started surrendering in large groups because they knew they would be treated well. Colonel Lim Sangyun continued. Their civilians started requesting human protection from their own military. Their government collapsed because it could not maintain legitimacy against enemies who were obviously more moral than they were. It was exactly what Elder Krethos had predicted months earlier. The humans had not just won a military victory, they had won a moral victory so complete that their enemies had voluntarily joined them. The pattern repeated itself across the galaxy. Species after species challenged human forces, expecting to exploit their perceived weakness. Each time, the humans responded with the same combination of overwhelming military superiority and absolute moral restraint. Each time, they won not just battles but conversions. Kethvar found himself traveling throughout human space, speaking to representatives from dozens of different species. His role had evolved from translator to teacher to something approaching an evangelist for human military philosophy. The key insight, he would tell audiences of confused alien military leaders, is that humans do not limit their power in spite of wanting to win. They limit their power because that is how they win. During one particularly memorable presentation to a gathering of hegemony admirals, he tried to explain what he had learned. We always believed that the strongest military was the one that could cause the most destruction, he said, but the humans have shown us that the strongest military is the one that can achieve its objectives, while causing the least destruction. Anyone can destroy a planet. It takes real strength to capture a planet while making its population grateful that you did. Admiral Orthkes, his former commander, interrupted angrily. You sound like you have been brainwashed by human propaganda. Kethvar had expected this reaction. Have I been brainwashed, perhaps? But if so, I have been brainwashed by evidence. The humans have defeated every enemy they have faced, often while being significantly outnumbered. Their laws of war are not a weakness. They are a weapon we never learned to use. The debate that followed was intense and sometimes hostile, but by the end, several hegemony officers were asking detailed questions about human military protocols. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Months passed. More species encountered human forces. More species discovered that trying to exploit human restraint was like trying to exploit the restraint of a mountain. The restraint was real, but so was the power it concealed. Gradually, a new understanding began to spread through the galaxy. The humans were not weak because they followed laws of war. They were following laws of war because they were strong enough to choose how they used their strength. Kethvar received regular reports about the progress of this cultural shift. Species that had initially seen human mercy as weakness were beginning to adopt similar principles themselves, not because they had been conquered, but because they had seen the results those principles produced. The transformation was not complete, and probably never would be. But it was beginning. The galaxy was slowly learning that there were better ways to resolve conflicts than mutual annihilation. Late one night, as Kethvar worked on a presentation for a conference of galactic military leaders, he realized something profound had happened to him. He was no longer trying to understand human thinking, so he could report back to his own people. He was trying to understand human thinking so he could help spread it to everyone. Somewhere along the way, without quite realizing it, he had stopped being a hegemony officer studying human behavior and had become an advocate for human principles. The thought should have horrified him. Instead, it filled him with something he had never experienced before: hope for the future of the galaxy.